What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Big Ten Football Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Zach Guggenheim, and we are talking about the college football playoff rankings. They came out Tuesday night, the same night as the presidential election. Make sure to like, follow, subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Apple, Google, Spotify, not Google. They don't do that anymore. Sorry. Apple, Spotify, YouTube, which I guess is kind of Google. You guys know what I mean. So make sure you follow us there. My goal in this episode is really just to break down the rankings that came out on Tuesday night. I thought it was fascinating how they brought it out. It talked about a little bit of things. Probably the biggest thing that was shocking for me was Ohio State and Georgia were 2 and 3 rather than the other way around. And we'll talk about that. But there's several other things as well that we need to discuss in regards to the Big Ten with these rankings. And so that's what we're going to talk about. Programming note, I will not be dropping an episode next week. I'll be on vacation. I'll also be away from the Big Ten Huddle and the Ohio State call-in show for the Voice of College Football. But I will be back in 2 weeks. My hope, I need to actually send out some messages here before I head out for vacation. My hope is to get maybe someone from the Hoosier Huddle on to talk about Indiana's success this year. I would love to get some of the other podcasts on again, like we did in the summer with the off season, to kind of break down their seasons, and particularly the teams that have really done well this season. So I'm gonna reach out to a few folks and see if we can touch base about that. Get really content from across the channel or across the College Huddle network. But let's talk about these rankings here. I'll just do the top 10 because after that there's no more Big Ten teams. But number 1 is Oregon, which I think is the easiest, number 1 that we could pick, right? Oregon has a win over Ohio State. They have a win over number 12 Boise State. They're undefeated. Clearly the number 1 team in the country right now by resume and honestly by look. They've looked the most complete out of anybody. Number 2, Ohio State. Number 3, Georgia. Number 4, Miami. Number 5, Texas. Number 6, Penn State. Number 7, Tennessee. Number 8, Indiana. Number 9, BYU. Number 10, Notre Dame. And I think there's a lot here that is just very interesting. No other Big Ten teams are ranked, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I want to start with just my reactions. So 1, I was shocked that Ohio State was number 2, and quite honestly, that Penn State was number 6. You look at, at different things, and you're like, well, Ohio State has only played 2 ranked teams. They lost to 1 and they beat 1. Now, granted, they lost to the number 1 team in the country by 1 point, and they had a chance to win it at the end, and they just didn't get the playoff, right? But I didn't think that would be enough to overcome the committee, particularly when you think about Georgia and what they've accomplished, despite the fact that I say that the SEC stinks. The reality is they have played a hard schedule. They've played a hard schedule, and they've won multiple ranked games. And I was surprised that they were third. They had a 15-point win on the road against Texas. They had a 7-point loss to number 11 Alabama, right? They clobbered Clemson at home. And granted, Clemson's at the bottom of the top 25 in these rankings, but that's 2 ranked wins, a ranked loss, and 2 ranked wins by double digits, including 1 on the road at Texas. And so I really thought going into the rankings, Georgia would be higher than Ohio State. And even if you look at the strength of schedule, Georgia, according to Sagarin, has the number 5 hardest schedule. So I was surprised by that. If you look at resumes with FPI, Georgia has the strongest strength of record out of anybody, right? Their strength of schedule, according to FBI, is 1. The remaining strength of schedule is 5. Their game control metric is 7. So I was really surprised that the committee would put Ohio State 2 over Georgia 3. And their rationale, which I think makes sense, is Ohio State's consistency. And when they said that, my first thought was, did you see him against Nebraska? But then I had to come off the ledge a little bit, because with Georgia, it's like, did you see Georgia against Mississippi State? Did you see Georgia against Florida? Did you see Georgia against Auburn? Did you see Georgia against Alabama? Did you see Georgia against Kentucky? Like, really, they've played 2 games where you're like, oh yeah, Georgia might be the best team in the country. And that was against Clemson, who you only thought about that for a half. And against Texas, who, even though they played, their defense was phenomenal, their offense was like, eh. And like, while Will Howard has not always, like, he has not made great decisions all the time, have you seen Carson Beck? Because that dude has become a turnover machine. And so I think the rationale for Ohio State over Georgia made sense. That being said, I think if Ohio State and Georgia both win out, heading into conference championship weekend, I think it's going to be tough to keep Ohio State ahead of them. Because if you look at Georgia's schedule, they've got Ole Miss, who's ranked number 16th, and they've got Tennessee, who's number 7. And while Ohio State's got Indiana, who we'll talk about, I think we're already seeing how much the committee does not value Indiana, regardless of what they say. They don't value them. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And I think that's the only ranked win. You've got maybe the 2 worst teams in the Big Ten. Purdue absolutely is the worst team in the Big Ten. And then you've got Michigan, who is 5-4 and is in danger of missing a bowl game. Now, I don't think they will. I think they will get a 6th win against Northwestern. But the reality is, you have Indiana, and your next best game might be a 6-5 Michigan team by the time you play them. Right? So that's problematic. Now, if Georgia loses, then it really does open the door for Ohio State to be number 2. But at the end of the day, for Ohio State, it doesn't really matter, because if Georgia wins out and Ohio State wins out, we're maybe talking about seeding. And the only thing is, if Georgia wins out and then loses, and then Ohio State wins out and then loses, Ohio State or Georgia, I would think, would probably get the 5 seed, and Ohio State would get the 6 seed. If Georgia wins out and wins the SEC and Ohio State loses the Big Ten championship game, Ohio State's going to be the 5 seed. And if both Georgia and Ohio State win their conferences, Georgia's good. My guess, well, I don't know, because then Ohio State would have to play Oregon as the number 1 team in the country. And I am making the assumption that Oregon's finishing number 1 at this point. Their schedule, their toughest game might be Washington at this point, and I don't trust Washington as much as I can throw them. That's just kind of how it is. Oregon, they've got Maryland, LOL. Sorry, Terp fans, but it's bad. At Wisconsin, they've proven that they really aren't. They have not progressed like I thought they would. And Washington at home, they're going to win all those games. Like, you have the rivalry factor with Washington, so maybe Washington explodes on them. I highly doubt it, especially after a bye week. So that would open the door. But here's what I really want to get to is, I think the fact that they were number 2 indicates that if Ohio State wins out or they lose a game, even if it's Michigan and not Indiana, they're fine. Now, the folks in Columbus might not think that they're fine, but they're fine. They're going to get into the playoff. The only way they don't get into the playoff is if they fall off a cliff. So that's takeaway number 1. Number 2, I'm shocked that Penn State's number 6, because you look at Penn State's schedule and their strength of schedule. Penn State has the, believe it or not, the 32nd best schedule according to Sagarin, while Tennessee has the 36th. Shocked by that. And then you look at FPI, and their strength of record, believe it or not, is 6th overall, even though they're ranked 11th in FPI. And they have their strength of schedule at 28th. Now, their remaining strength of schedule is 56th, so that's not great. But interestingly enough, a lot of the computers see them as having a pretty strong strength of schedule. And despite the fact that they don't have any ranked wins, they do have a win against Illinois. They're ranked at the time. While they have, while USC is 4-5, the computers really favor them in the computers. Here's the insanity of FPI and Sagarin. USC is 17th in FPI. And according to Sagarin, USC is 26th, despite the fact that they're 4-5. Now, USC's really difficult strength of schedule helps them a lot. And I think the win against LSU really helps too. But the reality is the computers, which is a factor, right? The humans, the human committee is looking at all these different data points. That really matters. It matters in their form, in their formula. So their strength of schedule is actually really helping them, despite the fact that they have no current ranked wins. Now, I think if Penn State loses again, I think they might be in a little bit of trouble. But the reality is a lot of teams that they would be competing with are either going to jump up because they're going to have big wins, or they're going to be, they're going to be kicked out. So just looking at Georgia's schedule, they've got Tennessee and they've got Ole Miss. If Georgia beats both of those, I have a hard time seeing Tennessee getting back into the picture. And that's a team that Penn State's competing with. Because look at, Penn State or Tennessee's schedule, it's a little bit less, it's not as good as Penn State's according to the computers. And then their only big win is Alabama. And that's it. And then if you look at the rest of their schedule, they've got Mississippi State. They've got Georgia. If they lose to Georgia, I don't know if they get back into it. Their only hope, is they go 10-2 and other people fall around. And, can they really bank on a win against Vanderbilt to prop up their case? So I think Penn State is in a reasonably good position because of the way the committee is viewing them ahead of Tennessee right now. So I think it's really good. Here's another reaction that I have, though, and I am annoyed. If Miami is 4, why is Indiana not 5? There's no consistency to me. If Miami is 4, but Indiana is 8. And I know people will say, look at their strength of schedule. It's abysmal. I get that. I do. I get it. Is it really that different, though? Indiana is 12th in the Sagarin ratings. Miami is 8th. Their strength of schedule, Miami's 54. Indiana's 81. Okay, that's not good. Indiana has not played a top 30 team. Miami has played 3 top 30 teams. Okay, so that's different. That's good. But it's outside of that, Indiana has played, let's see, this is according to Sagarin again. They played number 43 Washington, number 50 Nebraska, beat Washington by 14 with a backup quarterback, and they beat Nebraska by infinity. So I guess it's negligible. You look at Miami's schedule, and they've struggled often, by the way, in their schedule. They've played, they struggled against Duke. Duke's not great. They struggled against Louisville. Louisville's now a top 25 team. Good on them. They struggled to beat Cal. They struggled to beat Virginia Tech. I like it isn't a strong resume, guys. And yes, they beat Florida when Florida was a shell of who they are now, right? They weren't playing DJ Lagway back then. So I get that Florida is 24th in Sagarin. I get that Virginia Tech is 29th in Sagarin, right? I get that. And if you look at FPI, looking at Miami and who they've played, they played Louisville, who's 14th in FPI. That matters. They've played a few more. So I get that Miami has some advantages in the schedule. I get that. I'm not advocating that Indiana be ranked ahead of Miami, but I am questioning why they are so much further behind. Why are they behind Penn State and Tennessee and Texas? When if you look at all these ratings and if you're putting Miami fourth, you know who's right by them? Indiana. Like again, Sagarin, Miami's 8 and Indiana's 12. In FPI, Miami's 9, Indiana's 10. Like they're very close together. And especially when you take into account that BYU is right behind Indiana. BYU, they're ranked 21st in the Sagarin. Their strength of schedule's markedly better, but they're ranked 21 in Sagarin. BYU is ranked, let's see, 28th. 28th. And granted, they have good wins. They beat SMU. SMU 16th in FPI. So they've done it. They beat Kansas State. Kansas State's 22 in FPI. Didn't just beat them, they blew the doors off them 38-9. I get that. But if you're looking at all the ratings and all the metrics and you're saying, well, Indiana and BYU are kind of the same. Indiana is way closer to Miami than they are to BYU. Like easily based on the ratings. And so you got to imagine that they're looking at ranked wins and they're saying, well, that's part of it. But man, you look at game control, you look at like their strength, Indiana's strength of record is 7th. And you look at their game control, it's 4th overall. I mean, that's better than everybody but Ole Miss, Ohio State, and Oregon. Like that's insane. Like they are controlling games from start to finish. And so I don't understand it. I understand if you're like, I think the one-loss teams ahead of them are better and have proven themselves. That's fine. I just don't think you can have Miami 4 spots ahead of Indiana and be like, well, Miami's that much better. I don't think so. Like, I think Miami has really struggled. And, again, going to game control in FPI, Miami is 15th. Like, that's one stat. I know I'm cherry picking a little bit. I don't see the justification for the difference between Miami and Indiana. I think you got to either pair them together below those one-loss teams, or you got to pair them above those one-loss teams. And so maybe if you're like, well, we really believe in Texas, which quite honestly, what has Texas proven? Like, I know that they had that big win against Michigan back when Michigan was thought to be better than they are. But look at their schedule, man. Like, they've played, they played Michigan, they played Colorado State, they played UTSA, LA Monroe, Mississippi State, who is awful, Oklahoma, who is doubly awful, and then they lost to Georgia and they barely beat Vanderbilt. Like this Texas team actually hasn't proven much at all. So, like, why are they 4 or why are they 5th? Right? I get it. Texas is supposed to be good. That's why, which is a bad reason for a ranking. Again, Penn State, and I love Penn State, but why are they 6th and Indiana 8th when Penn State has not beaten a currently ranked team and they lost their only ranked game at home? Not saying I'm not trying to pick a fight with Penn State. I'm just saying that it seems like the only reason why we're saying Indiana is lower is because Indiana has the Indiana logo. You can make an argument because of their strength of schedule, but they're blowing teams out like nobody's business. And the teams above them don't have much more in terms of resume. So I just don't agree with how they're going about it. I'm really curious to see what the committee does if Indiana does beat Michigan by more than 14 points. Because even though Michigan's not great, they're still top 40 in the Sagarin ratings. I think in terms of FPI, let's see, FPI they're 46th, so top 50 team. But there's perception with Michigan too, and I'm curious what they think. So that's I just think they're wrong. I think if you're going to put Miami 4, you got to put Indiana closer to them than you put them to BYU. I like BYU they're a nice story, but the reality is even though they've beaten some ranked teams, the overall strength of the league that they're playing in is not good, which brings me to my next reaction. If you look at the rankings, unless if there is sheer shenanigans that happen in the ACC and Big 12, the Big 12 and the ACC are one team bid leagues. They're one bid leagues. You know, if you go through the rankings, I'll just go through the ACC right now. So number 4 is Miami, and then you have to go to 13 for SMU, and then after that you have Pitt at 18th, and you have Louisville at 22 and Clemson at 23. I don't know if any of those teams, maybe outside of SMU, that really have a chance to work their way up the board. And the reality is, if Miami wins out, then they're going to they're going to knock whoever the winner, the second place team is, they're going to knock them out. And so unless if Miami goes undefeated and then loses in the ACC championship game, I think this is a one bid league in the ACC, which I think bodes well for the Big Ten, bodes well for Indiana. But the other thing is, I think the Big 12 is also in trouble. If you look at the Big 12, you look at their teams in the thing, their highest ranked team is BYU at 9. And then you look, excuse me, you look at the rest of it. Iowa State 17, Kansas State's 19, Colorado's 20. Like, that's not going to get it done. Like, you don't have enough big games to boost you up. And it just shows that the committee does not value this league. So we knew that was a possibility going in. I think this just confirms it, that the ACC, the Big 12, most likely are one bid leagues unless there's chaos. Like if BYU continues to win, maybe they work themselves up to 6 or 5, and then Iowa State or Kansas State or Colorado wins the Big 12. Then it becomes a little bit more chaotic. But the other thing about that's interesting, Boise State's hanging around at 12. So there's no guarantee that the group of 5 champion that goes to the playoff is going to be the 12 seed. Like Boise State, they could get a higher seed. They might even get an automatic bye. They might get that 4 seed. Because if there's chaos, right? Like Miami loses, BYU loses, and then you've got if you have, say, a 2-loss champion in the ACC or the Big 12, I'm not so sure that Boise's not getting that 4th spot or even the 3rd spot. because the committee really values Boise. Despite the fact that their schedule has not been good, I think they really value that Boise only lost to Oregon by 3. I think they really value that Ashton Genty is a stud and is a Heisman candidate. So that's a big deal. And that I think that's just something to watch out for because that does impact the Big Ten positively. The other thing, and we were talking about this a little bit on the Big Ten huddle, Iowa and Minnesota have a little bit of reason to be upset not being included in the rankings. But I will say this, largely, I'm okay with it. They'll have their chance. I would be more upset if there was a 6-3 Vanderbilt team on here. And people get upset. Like people have said, well, Vandy looks pretty good. Listen, I'm tired of people convincing you that Vanderbilt is good because they beat Alabama. Because they're in the mighty SEC. Okay? Yes, they are better than they've been. I will give them credit there. I'll absolutely give them credit there. But there's also a reality. You have to account for the whole of your schedule. You have to account for that. So are we really saying that Vandy is good when they struggled to beat Ball State? Are we really saying that Vanderbilt's good if we're saying that they struggled to beat Auburn? Like, are we really doing this? Okay, by the way, Ball State, who they only beat by 10, they're 3-6 and 2-3 in the MAC. Like, are we really saying this? Are we really saying that Vanderbilt's good when they lose on the road to Georgia State? Georgia State has more wins against the SEC this year than the Sun Belt, which is their conference. They're 0-4 in the Sun Belt. They're 2-6. They stink. And if Iowa or Minnesota are ranked behind Vanderbilt, which like they are in the AP and the coaches poll, you should lose your darn vote. But that's not what happened because the CFP committee's smart, or smarter at least. They did rank Missouri, which Missouri is an odd choice, but they are 6-2. They're 6-2. So because of the record, I can understand it. But the reality is Missouri is going to lose again too. I mean, they're the rest of their schedule. I would not be surprised they lose to Oklahoma or at South Carolina, and then they get Mississippi State and Alabama, or Arkansas. Sorry, and Arkansas. LOL. It's not. Anyway, I'm going to get off my Vanderbilt soapbox here. Here's my point. Iowa and Minnesota, I would have liked to see ranked, but the reality is the teams that have them crowded out are a 6-2 Missouri team, a 6-2 Clemson team, an 8-0 Army team, and a 6-3 Louisville team who did just beat Clemson. Like Washington State 7-1. Like I just don't see with who they put in there. I'm like, okay, like I think they should be in next week if they win. Like if Minnesota wins, if Iowa wins. But the reality is there's a lot of parity this year, and there's a lot of teams with good records. And I think that might block some teams, which I don't think impacts. The only impact that it might have is if Penn State loses to Minnesota. And I think that's a possibility because I think Minnesota's really getting good. It'll help prop up Minnesota in the rankings for sure. But Penn State, if they're viewed with a loss against an unranked team, that could be problematic for them in the playoff race, which gets into my implications. So I already said, I think unless Ohio State falls off a cliff, they're in. I don't think it matters if they lose, if they have another loss. I don't think it matters in terms of playoff resume. Again, Columbus, You can still freak out because you know how good this team was supposed to be, but they're going to be in the playoff unless if they lose 2 of the next 4. Like they're in. And that the committee showed that. So is Oregon, by the way. Oregon, if they lose 2 out of the next 3, it's not going to matter. They're going to be in. Penn State's in as long as they don't lose. Like they control their own destiny. But if they lose, they're going to need they're going to need some chalk, right? They're going to need, like, as much as crazy as it sounds, they're going to need Alabama to beat LSU. They're going to need Georgia to beat Tennessee and Ole Miss. Like, they're just going to need that to happen. I think if that happens, I think Penn State's in at 10-2. Indiana is a bit more precarious because the committee has shown that they do not respect the schedule and they don't respect the logo. So they need to either win out, which if they win out, they're in, obviously, or I think they need to keep it close against Ohio State, which I think they probably will. But I think Indiana is in a precarious position with these first rankings. Now, I might be wrong. If Tennessee loses this weekend and, if BYU, if all these other teams lose, honestly, the best thing for Indiana would be if Notre Dame would lose, which I don't think is going to happen. Who knows with USC, what will happen with them, but I doubt it. But you never know. It's weird, but Notre Dame's schedule, they get Army on the 23rd, November 23rd. That's a ranked matchup, and they get USC on the 30th. They have Florida State and Virginia. LOL, they'll win those games handily. And then, but it would really help Indiana if Notre Dame would drop another game. I think it'd really help them. But I think if Indiana's close at Ohio State, I think they have a good chance. I think if they get blown out by Ohio State, I think they're in a precarious position because they just don't respect their resume or the logo. So, in general, this bodes well for the Big Ten, right? Big 12 is most likely a one team league. ACC is going to be a 1-team league most likely. I think Notre Dame has to win out to have a shot. I think that's what these rankings bear out because Notre Dame was 10th. If they don't win out, they're in trouble because they only have one more ranked game and they're not, Army's 25th. They're 18th, I think, in the AP poll. Army's 25th. If, they obviously don't respect Army all that much. Excuse me. Sorry, I just yawned. It's late. I'm tired. So Notre Dame has to win out. So, and the SEC they're going to beat each other up. And so Alabama, LSU is probably an elimination game. Texas and Texas A&M is probably it might be an elimination game. It's certainly an elimination game for A&M. And who knows with Texas? Like, I don't know. Like, Texas, I would imagine that they're okay with another loss, but I don't know, like it really depends. I think Ole Miss is probably out after they play Georgia, Tennessee. Tennessee has a couple of big games that they have to prove themselves in, including Georgia. So, and there's this reality too that Georgia loses twice in the next few weeks and they're out. So I think the SEC is most likely also a 4-team league. I would say, looking at things now, you would have a 4. If things kind of play out the way we think, I think you probably have 4 teams from the Big Ten, 4 teams from the SEC, 1 from the ACC, 1 from the Big 12, 1 group of 5 in Boise State and Notre Dame. That would be my guess is what they'll do or what would happen. But we got 4 weeks left in the college football season. Anything can happen. So stay tuned. Make sure you are locked in because we've got a crazy month ahead of us, friends. So thank you for listening. Again, we'll be off next week, but we'll be back in a couple weeks. So thanks for listening. Take care. God bless.